Good evening, gentlemen. I'm going to talk to you today on Ukraine and its connection with Russia. As we all know, Ukraine is an independent country at the moment, but it wasn't like this for the last 200 years. Actually, if you look back in history, from 1793, Ukraine has been a part of Russia. That was the time when Catherine the Great ruled Russia. And that's a good past of 229 years back. Intermittently, Ukraine continued to be part of Russia off and on, and finally there was the 1917 revolution led by Vladimir Lenin, and the communist regime came into being in Ukraine as well as Russia, and Ukraine was incorporated as a part of independent republic of the Soviet Union. Now both the Ukrainians and the Russians are from the same race. They are the Slav race. Their language is similar, but there are subtle differences between the two, and these have been accentuated during the communist regime. When the Tsars were ruling Russia, they were not at all harsh on the Ukrainians. They let the Ukrainians live a peaceful life. And when Lenin took over, the same thing happened. It continued. But Lenin didn't last long, and in 1924, Lenin died. And when he died, his successor was Joseph Stalin. Now, before I say further, let me bring you one interesting fact that Ukraine has produced three important leaders for the Soviet Union. Nikita Khruschev, first secretary of the Communist Party after Stalin died, was born in Ukraine. Leonid Brezhnev was also from Ukraine. And then we had Cherenenko, who also was from Ukraine. So Ukraine had a big contribution in the Soviet Union, but there is a big but. The Russians, I'm afraid to say, didn't treat the Ukrainians the way the Ukrainians expected them to be treated. And the problem started in 1924 when Stalin came into power. Now, Stalin, uh, some people consider him to be the great man. In my book, he is great, but he had a lot of blind spots. He was a man driven by one ambition, and that is one philosophy, that is the Marxist philosophy, and he wanted to enforce that all over the Soviet Union. He believed in the collectivization of agriculture. Now, this is where the problem really started between Ukraine and Soviet Russia. In 1931, Stalin had decided to enforce what we call the collectivization of agriculture. That means the individual land holdings were to be abolished and the state would take over. There would be collective farms and the farmers would work there. Now, all over Russia, generally, there was not much of resistance to this policy of Joseph Stalin. But in Ukraine, it was different. The Ukrainians had always a degree of independence in their own ability, and the Ukrainian farmers were not ready to accept the diktat from the Kremlin, led by Joseph Stalin. What did they do? They started resisting the reforms which Stalin wanted to enforce. When Stalin got the reports of this resistance from the Ukrainian peasantry, he was really infuriated. He was a man, as I've told you, with a one track vision to make Russia a global power, and he believed that the only way forward was the Marxist way, as enunciated in his own interpretation of what Karl Marx had written in the book Das Kapital. Whether he was wrong or right is not the point. The point is he had decided on this course of action, he was going to enforce it. When Ukraine refused, they had to pay a terrible consequence for their refusal. And that was in the form of a induced famine. Now, this famine cannot be dismissed so easily because, unfortunately, there were some correspondents from the Western countries who were in Moscow at that time I wouldn't like to name them. You can see them in the read about them in the internet, who treated this famine as a shortage of agricultural goods. They didn't say it's a famine. And Stalin was able to get away with it because he was selling the produce to the British and the Americans to earn some money, trade. So Stalin wanted the collectivization of agriculture in Ukraine so that the state could take over the entire production of Ukraine and export it. When the Ukrainians resisted, he passed a decree wherein harsh penalties were enforced on the Ukrainian peasantry, number one. Number two, their entire produce was to be taken away and sold to the foreign countries or in other parts of Russia, and the Ukrainians were to be given nothing. Now, this thing lasted 18 months. It was a terrible time for Ukraine. And I can tell you that in the 1931 census, the population of Ukraine was 32 million. And in 1939, when a census was taken, the population was 30 million. Considering that there's a rate of increase of at least 2.6% per year, it obviously means that about 7 million Ukrainians didn't see the light of the day. They died. I don't have the figures. Frankly, nobody has figures because the Soviet Union consistently denied that they did anything in Ukraine. Khruschev, in his famous speech in 1956, when he criticized Stalin, didn't mention about Ukraine, mind you. He just kept quiet on that. Nobody mentioned about it. Brezhnev also didn't mention about it, though both these leaders had their roots in Ukraine. Now, what actually happened in that man-made famine was that the produce was taken away by force, and those who opposed were shot dead or taken away to Siberia. And secondly, no food was available for the Ukrainians to eat. And it was a terrible situation. I can just imagine. And as per the estimate of the Western press, at least 3 to 4 million Ukrainians died of hunger. It's a very sad thing that in a Soviet state which professes to be a Marxist state, believing in the Marxist theory of equality, didn't enforce it in their realm, in their region. Ukraine was singled out for opposing the collectivization of agriculture, and the net result was there was hunger and famine. 3 to 4 million Ukrainians died, and finally, the Russians were hiding the facts from the world. And in 1933 or 34, Stalin relented because he thought the Ukrainians had been broken and beaten, and some grains were allowed inside. But these were also eaten away by the enforcers who were enforcing the writ of Stalin on the Ukrainians. There's a very interesting conversation. In 1942, Winston Churchill had paid a visit to Moscow. And during a drinking session with Stalin, he asked him, "How do you feel about the Ukrainian crisis in comparison to what you are facing now, the assault of Hitler?" Stalin didn't bat an eyelid. He remembered everything. He said, "I think the greater danger to Marxist rule, to the Marxist philosophy, was Ukraine." And Stalin mentioned that probably 10 million died, and he justified it and said it was necessary. Now, this is something which obviously cannot be accepted by any historian, and I will say is the black mark on Stalin. Stalin had all the means of repression, enforcement under his control, and he could have gone about Ukraine in a different manner, but he didn't do it. And then came the Great Patriotic War, in 1941, Germany on 22nd June invaded the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian peasantry, which was for long in anger against the Russian military and the Russian government and Stalin, were absolutely delighted. And I have seen pictures of the London news of that period where the Ukrainian peasantry were holding up their crosses, and welcoming the Germans. They thought the Germans are going to come and give us deliverance from the Soviet yoke. Unfortunately, Hitler missed a great opportunity, and because he was dictated by his racial theories, and he considered the Slavs to be the inferior race, and he thought that the Ukrainians are also Slavs, so they don't deserve to be treated as human; they are subhuman. And within another week, or maybe 2 or 3 weeks, the Ukrainians soon realized that these chaps are worse than the Russians. What was happening when the Russian army was coming? Sorry, the German army was coming, the very mad, and all their talk of professionalism of the various field marshals, Manstein, Klug, Rundstedt, all of them, they're one and the same side of the brick, like Hitler. So they knew what was happening. The German army would move into the villages, and all the young girls between the ages of 14 and 40 who could bear children were taken away and segregated. They were all of them stripped naked before the German soldiers, and the doctor would come and examine them and then uh, dish out a few of the girls to the soldiers, and those who were the beautiful ones, and they were handed over to the officers. The Ukrainians realized, what the hell is happening? We were welcoming these Nazis, and this is what they're doing. That is the time when the resistance movement picked up, and the feeling of patriotism and hatred for the Germans became more important than fighting Stalin, and they joined up with the Red Army. The Ukrainian partisans played a great part behind lines, harassing the Germans, the Wehrmacht, and the net result was Germany was hard pressed. I thought if Hitler had a spark of genius, he would have appreciated what the Ukrainians were doing, but he didn't. And net result was that it became one great war in which the Ukrainians were with the Russians. And finally, you know what happened? Germany was defeated, and Ukraine became a part of the Soviet Union. At that time, Stalin died away in 1953, and Khruschev took over. And Khruschev did something very foolish. Maybe he thought, he would keep Ukraine forever with him, and Ukraine now going to be part of Russia only. So the Crimea was transferred to Ukraine. I mean, these were the things the Soviets kept on doing. And the Soviets used to do the transposition of population, yani lift entire populations and take them to Siberia or some other place. They've done in other places, but they couldn't do that in the Soviet in Ukraine because Ukrainians were over 30 million. You can't transfer a population of 30 million, so they let that go. But after 45, Ukraine was an integral part of the USSR, and everything was fine, I thought, till the economic crisis of Russia came up. By 89, the Afghan war had sapped Russian. Brezhnev had gone, Cherenenko died, and then there were a non-disc leadership, and one of those gentlemen who came up was a fellow called Gorbachev. Now, I remember reading a book that Gorbachev was actually a CIA agent. I mean, it's just meant as a pun. He was not a CIA agent, and I'll say he was an extremely foolish man, an idiot. He decided that the Soviet Union couldn't continue as it is, and so he decided to have liberalism and freedom and so many other things. He started off, and the states began to break away. The states which had been kept in the force with force by the Tsarist regime, by Stalin and Lenin, began to fritter away. At that time in 92, the Soviet Union collapsed because economy was defunct. There was no money in the coffers. There's nothing could be done. And there was a military coup which wanted to restore the Soviet Union back, but they failed. And this gentleman, Gorbachev, had his way. I don't know. I've been trying to analyze Gorbachev, but I couldn't understand any rationale as to what he was planning, what he was thinking. And recently he died. I made a video on him also. I think the Russians are pretty, fed up of this man. And so they didn't give him any honor, nothing. He just passed away into oblivion. But he didn't go into oblivion because he's going to be the man who broke the Soviet Union. There were other ways he could have kept the Soviet Union together. He didn't do it. And he allowed there to be a plebiscite to be held. Like there was a plebiscite held in Ukraine. And they won. And the Ukrainian population said, we want to be independent. So they became independent. The states in Central Asia, like Kazakhstan, which for decades had been part of the Tsarist and the Russian Empire, were also given freedom. Well, freedom, you can use any other word for it, they broke away. And Ukraine, as far as Ukraine is concerned, became a separate entity. At that time, in 92, Ukraine was in the forefront of forming the CIS, the Organization of Central States. But very soon they began to turn because there was a pro-Russian president who came in, and the Americans were fanning the flames. They wanted to make Ukraine into a frontline state against Russia, and they dug up the old histories of what the Russians had done in Ukraine, like the man-made famine, the death of almost 3 to 4 million Ukrainians because of hunger. And so, in that atmosphere, this man Zelensky came into power. Now, Zelensky's coming into power was perhaps a disastrous thing for Ukraine. Because I've said Ukraine had grievance against the Soviet Union. Certainly, they had against the grievance. But that did not qualify them to become the enemies of Russia. But they played into the hands of Biden, and they decided that they would be the frontline state to oppose Russia. And Zelensky began to dream himself as a knight in shining armor who would destroy Russia. Now, this is the genesis of the present war. And precisely, I'm going to end my video here because the war is on, and the result is that the roots of this war are in history. Perhaps if the genocide hadn't taken place, Ukraine wouldn't have broken away from the Soviet Union, from the USSR, and from Russia. Because I've said, Ukrainians and the European Russians are one race, one people. They are the Slav race. They follow the same religion. They are the Eastern Orthodox Church. But then, history is nobody's friend. And I'm nobody's friend. I like to state facts. In this particular incident, which I've quoted, the blame squarely lies with the Russians. The Tsarists were much better, but the communists literally destroyed the the Russian Empire, which had been built so meticulously by the Tsars. Gentlemen, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. The battle is on. Let's see what happens. In the meanwhile, I will say, do subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends if you want to, and I will say, Jai Hind. God bless you all, and glory to India.